I light this chalice to remind us of the light of this community, of the love that holds us all, and of our deep interconnectedness.
Good morning. Our opening words this morning are by the Reverend Gretchen Haley, entitled The Bright Thread of Hope. There is too much beauty in this world to give up on it. And yet, it is also always too soon to surrender to cynicism. So bring your doubt, your skepticism, your downright confusion, even your bitterness. But in the midst of these, in the center, wrap your tender finger around that still bright thread of hope. Feel in your heart that steady hunger for something more, the vision we glimpse every day of the rising sun, the light that spreads across the face of the ones we love, the look of knowing all there is to know and still loving life, loving us just as it is, just as we are. For this hour, we come to celebrate, to praise, to give thanks, to refuse to give up, to steady ourselves, keepers of hope, brave builders of this still possible world. Come, let us worship together. Please join me in the recitation of our shared covenant. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. This week, I share the fourth and final story from the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee's annual program, Guest at Your Table. I know that many of you have been collecting for these important efforts for the past several weeks. In the next week, it would be great if you could forward your donations either to the UU Service Committee directly. You can find that information in our newsletter or on their website. Or you can make a check out to us, to UUCSC, with Guest at Your Table in the memo line, or you can go to the website and donate via our new donate button. Today's focus is on Mark Stagey. He's grappling with the painful truth that the world is not taking the necessary measures to prevent climate change impacts from becoming irreversible, including forced relocation due to sea level rise. Mark's a resident of the Marshall Island, and his work is focused on creating healing, agency, and leadership among those most impacted by climate change in the Marshall Islands. He bridges together indigenous and Western methodologies, promotes indigenous-led responses to climate change, and advances, maybe most importantly, self-determination for Marshall Islanders facing sea level rise, severe flooding, and other impacts. He first started collaborating with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee in 2017 through a project he was working on called the Marshall Islands Conservation Society. They were developing flood risk maps. And they did so in a really wonderful way. They interviewed tribal elders about past flooding events and natural ocean dynamics that may have contributed to these new and unexpected floods, and then worked with peers to build models to project future flooding anticipated from sea level rise. And he's developing a similar program with youth in the Marshall Islands. So with the UU Service Committee support, he's developing a groundwater quality monitoring project for a town that's supported entirely by a layer of underground freshwater. And it's replenished by rainwater that rests upon the denser seawater. So what happens with climate change, what happens in the water has every impact on these people's water sources. And increasingly, they're seeing that the frequent droughts have placed severe pressure on coastal groundwater systems. And this community-led research represents a break from the norm in the Marshall Islands. Typically, this sort of data analysis is done by outside agencies without taking into consideration community priorities and community knowledge. So by contrast, the work that Mark is leading helps shift decision-making in climate relocation planning from a top-down to a bottom-up approach. The data collected by this program, by this participatory research, is used to inform local advocacy, to ensure that communities have the tools they need to prepare for what climate change will bring, whether that means building protection in place or planning for a future that might not be able to be there. Because, as Mark tells us, he knows that forced relocation is forthcoming for many Marshallese in this low-lying land so greatly impacted by sea level rise. So I ask that you share generously. These efforts are important and ongoing, and they're a way that we can demonstrate the commitment to our values. Thank you in advance for your generosity. As I prepared for this worship service, I thought about how food insecurity has been a reality for so long, how even the phrase insecurity doesn't do justice to the reality of hunger, of simply not having the food one needs for survival. It made me think about the first time I recall beginning to grasp what lack of food actually meant. It was 1985, and Ethiopia was in the midst of a brutal drought, and people were literally starving to death. We saw this in the news every day in huge numbers, and they were just being allowed to die. And I remember when a bunch of musicians came together and created an anthem called We Are the World, and they did so both to raise money and to raise awareness. And on both fronts, they succeeded hugely. But I remember a few years out, I wondered, where were the governmental organizations? Where were the rich countries that had plenty of food? And why were these people allowed to die in plain sight when it didn't have to be this way? And there are a lot of answers to those questions. Answers that have to do with the devaluation of brown and black people. Answers that have to do with multilateral development banks that have long prioritized projects and power over people. Answers like the erosion of once healthy farmlands by climate change and monoculture farms, and on and on. And it taught me something that I'll never forget, that I never want to forget. It's that we'll let people die in plain sight when food is in fact plentiful. It's the allocation of the food that's in question. So in some ways, this massive increase in hunger during this time of COVID, it's a wake-up call for this country. People have been going hungry for years in big numbers, but the sheer number of those impacted is now too large to be ignored. Like many of you, I am still very shocked to see the miles of lines of cars in cities and elsewhere waiting for a week or so of donated food. The need is so high. So many people simply don't have what they need. And yet the food is there. It's just not with the people that most need it. It's this systematic inequality, this continued governmental acceptance of people starving, desperate for basic foods. And it shouldn't be so. Food should be a basic human right. No one should have to wonder how to live without food. I spent many days last summer volunteering for a Rhode Island group called Hope's Harvest. In the fields of Rhode Island and some in southern Massachusetts, we picked produce and vegetables that would have rotted on the vine or maybe have been plowed back into the soil. Instead, thanks to Hope's Harvest, myself and many, many other volunteers helped get this food picked, which was brought to the food bank and other food distribution organizations, and it made its way into the hands of people who need that food. And while this didn't come close to solving food insecurity in Rhode Island, it did help many. And I keep thinking about I keep thinking about the fact that since childhood, I've been taught we can't end hunger overnight. As though somehow it's permissible to have some with plenty and some with none. To have people's survival caught up in mechanisms well outside of their control. I'm glad to say that the work of many in this state, including our own Nessa Richmond, in her role with the Rhode Island Food Policy Council, they prove otherwise. At Hope's Harvest, well, they too are proving daily that this aphorism is wrong. We can, in fact, end hunger. So I've asked Hope's Harvest founder and director, Eva Agudelo, to speak with us today. You'll hear from her now about what they do and why. And then after service, Nessa Richmond will join us and Eva for an extended coffee hour and Q&A where you can ask questions and learn more. A little bit about Eva. She's worked with families, restaurants, retailers, farmers markets, nonprofits, and hunger relief agencies, always to improve community food security and bring about a food system that works for everyone. She started the National Incubator Farm Trading Initiative through the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. She served as a program officer at Wholesome Wave, supporting incentive programs at farmers markets across the U.S., and most recently was the assistant director of programs at the Rhode Island Community Food Bank, administering federal nutrition programs and supporting Rhode Island state network of food pantries and meal sites. She holds an MS from the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University and is a member of the Rhode Island Food Policy Council. We are delighted to hear from Eva.
Hello, my name is Eva Agudelo, and I am the founding director of Hope's Harvest Rhode Island. Thank you so much for having me here to speak with you today about our work. So, I want you to imagine that I'm holding a big, luscious, abundant platter of fruits and vegetables. Everything's fresh, everything's local, apples and carrots and chard and whatever you love to get at the farmer's market. And I'm holding it in my hands right now. Because this is virtual, I probably could have actually gotten a real platter of fruits and vegetables, but I did not do that. So imagine I'm holding this platter of fruits and vegetables, and now imagine that you're watching me walk over and throw it into a trash can. Now, I would like you to imagine that you watched me do that and you haven't eaten anything yet today because you only had enough food in the house to feed your children. So I didn't always have enough to eat as a child, and I know that there were times that my single mom skipped meals so that I could have enough. And I have dedicated the past 12 years of my life to ensuring that no one ever has to experience that. During my time working at the Rhode Island Community Food Bank in 2016 and 2017, I learned that in Rhode Island, 1 in 8 households couldn't afford adequate food. And at least 57,000 Rhode Islanders per month were relying on the emergency food system. Now, due to the pandemic, those numbers have actually gotten much, much worse. So now 1 in 4 households experience food insecurity. And that is the highest that it has been in Rhode Island in 20 years. We know that hunger, malnutrition, and diet-related diseases like hypertension and diabetes disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, which means that they are, without a doubt, and like so many of our other societal issues, a result of generational and systemic racism. In 2019, 20% of all of the food that was distributed by the Rhode Island Food Bank was fresh fruits and vegetables, which is great. It's wonderful that they're able to do that. However, the USDA actually recommends that a healthy diet is made up of at least 50% fresh fruits and vegetables. So 20%, like I said, definitely a good thing, but it's actually not enough to make sure that people who are experiencing food insecurity are actually able to access food that truly nourishes them. Meanwhile, there's a lot of different research out there that shows that between 4 and 34% of all of the food that's being planted on farms is not being harvested. So that depends on the crop. There's a big variation, right? Raspberries, people pick all of the raspberries, but corn, they leave a lot of corn behind. So that's why there's such a big discrepancy between 4 and 34%. What does that look like in Rhode Island? We're not an agricultural state, right? People don't think of us as, we're not Illinois, we're not the Midwest, we don't grow a lot of corn and soybeans. So maybe it's not that much. Well, between 4 and 34% of all food planted on farms in Rhode Island actually equals between 2 and 20 million pounds of food going to waste on farms each year. That actually equals about 80 million servings. And an extra 3 servings per person per day for those who are relying on the emergency food system. That's significant. That's a lot of food. Well, a lot of people want to know what prevents farmers from getting that food out of the fields. Well, sometimes they have labor to harvest a bumper crop and they can bring it to the food bank themselves. And sometimes they don't. Most farmers do what they do because they really love to feed people, and it actually breaks their heart to see good food go to waste. But margins on produce are tight, and farmers can't afford to pay people for produce that they can't sell. So a second picking of green beans or corn or carrots that got too big or squash that got scratched by a woodchuck, all of those foods can get left in the fields. You think about pest pressure or weather issues. There's a lot of different reasons that food ends up in the field and the farmer can't actually pick it and distribute it. So I gave you a lot of numbers, a lot of facts and figures, but what does it mean? Well, most importantly, we at Hope's Harvest believe that it's completely unacceptable for our friends and neighbors to be hungry or malnourished while good food goes to waste. And that nourishing the Rhode Island community with fresh, healthy, locally grown produce is an act of love and justice with the power to transform our world. Our solution to these intersecting problems of hunger and food waste is what we call farm-based food recovery, and it's also known as gleaning, which gets surplus out of the field and into the hands of the people who need it. Gleaning is actually an ancient practice first discussed in the Old Testament, books of Ruth, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, where farmers are actually directed to leave some of their crops behind for the poor. And it has continued throughout the ages all over the world. There's a strong tradition of gleaning in Europe. A lot of people remember going out into the fields when they were kids and collecting potatoes. It's a very common, very human, very old thing that people have done. And in this day and age, there's actually gleaning programs all over the country that currently rescue food, big and small, in New England, out west, all over. So it's very common practice. So how does it work here and now in Rhode Island? Well, at Hope's Harvest, farmers contact us when they have produce available. And our coordinators recruit, train, and notify volunteers. We sign them up for gleaning trips where we go out into the field, we harvest it, we get that food out of the field and packaged up safely. And then we distribute that food out to food pantries across the state. Hope's Harvest has been operating since 2018. In our first year, we recovered 36,000 pounds of food. We didn't know if farmers would call us. We didn't know if any volunteers would show up. We were pretty sure the agencies would want the food. So 36,000 pounds felt like a lot for us that year. In 2019, it was 78,000 pounds. So we more than doubled our first year's yields. And as of now, in 2020, we've recovered over 215,000 pounds. And our season isn't over yet. We go from May through April. So that's how we count our season. So as you can see, there's been sort of exponential growth in the amount of food that we've been able to recover from Rhode Island fields. And we're really, really proud of that work. To date, we've partnered with 25 farms, 30 different hunger relief agencies, and we've had over 600 volunteers commit about 2,800 hours to gleaning food from local farms. Our partners, farms and farmers across the state who are committed to feeding people, and hunger relief agencies doing the hard work of distributing food to people in need are all truly amazing. And the model works especially well because of our steady group of dedicated volunteers and groups that are committed to getting out on farms, getting their hands dirty, helping their friends and neighbors. So I hope that you will consider joining us out in the farms for gleaning trips in 2021. This past year showed us not only how much volunteers contribute to their communities when they glean with us, but also how much volunteers gained by having an outside activity that was safe, social, and active. And because we don't exist in a vacuum, we partner with a number of wonderful organizations across the state to broaden and deepen our reach and our impact. We are fiscally sponsored by Farm Fresh Rhode Island, and they have generously shared their trucks and their cold storage and delivery infrastructure with us as we got started. We work with the Rhode Island Food Policy Council, which you'll hear more about during coffee hour, and the University of Rhode Island Master Gardeners Program. We're an approved community service project of the Master Gardeners, and that just started last year, and we're really lucky and grateful to be working with them. We're also deeply committed as an organization to standing up for the inherent worth and dignity of every person and their rights to self-determination and food sovereignty by acknowledging and standing against systemic inequality in its many forms, including food insecurity. So this year we partnered with the Tamaqua Museum this past fall to share about how colonialism and the genocide of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples who are native to this land have affected their ancestral foodways and how they keep their food traditions alive. That was a really powerful event. We also have a number of specific initiatives geared towards making our local food system more resilient to shocks from climate change and the economic impacts of the pandemic by contracting with local farms and purchasing surplus product for the emergency food system when it's available. We do this because we know we're all better off when all of our friends and neighbors can access fresh, healthy food, and because we know that our future is at stake. So instead of imagining that plate of veggies we talked about at the beginning going in the trash or rotting in the field, let's instead imagine a Rhode Island where everyone has enough. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all at the coffee hour and answering questions and sharing more about our work. Thank you again so much for having me, and warm wishes for your safety and health.
Spirit of life and of love, conspire with us to create a world where all have access to nutritious and sustainable food sources, and none live with scarcity or food insecurity. Collaborate with us to end oppressive and unjust systems. Mobilize us to be part of a world response that works in partnership with those of goodwill to foster equitable resource sharing. Cultivate our resilience and expand our imaginations so that we might continually find new ways to answer the call to end hunger so that all may flourish. Amen.
Carry the flame of peace and love until we meet again. Carry the flame of peace and love until we meet again. carry the flame of peace and love until